President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office in Ouagadougou long after midnight. The city outside was silent, but inside his mind a storm brewed. Reports had reached his desk again and again, not from ministers or generals, but from ordinary truck drivers, market traders, and even widows who had lost everything. They spoke of the same wound eating away at the nation, the border crossings. Every truck that carried goods into or out of Burkina Faso, whether sacks of rice, barrels of fuel, or spare parts for machinery, faced the same silent tax, $1,000. It was not written in law, not collected by the Treasury, and not acknowledged by officials. It was demanded at gunpoint, whispered through clenched teeth, or signaled by a subtle hand gesture from a uniformed man at the barrier. Over 8 long years, the numbers had grown into something monstrous. An investigation by a small team of whistleblowers estimated the network had stolen $347 million. Money that should have built schools, paid teachers, and bought medicine had vanished into private pockets. Meanwhile, truck drivers lived in misery, barely able to feed their families after each trip. Traoré knew speeches were not enough. Arresting a few low-ranking officers was not enough. To destroy the rot, he needed to see it with his own eyes, touch it with his own hands, and catch it in the act. That night, as the fan hummed above him, he whispered to himself, "If I want to know the truth, I must become one of them. I must ride where they ride, sleep where they sleep, and pay what they pay." And so the impossible idea took root. 3 days later, in a quiet warehouse outside the capital, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a cracked mirror. His usual military uniform and beret were gone. In their place hung dusty jeans, a faded football jersey, and a sun-bleached cap. His face was shadowed by stubble, his hands roughened with dirt and grease. No one looking at him now would recognize the head of state. He was no longer the young president who had taken the country by storm. He was simply Issa, a struggling truck driver desperate to make ends meet. Beside him stood Captain Diallo, one of the few men he trusted with his life. Diallo frowned as he inspected the disguise. "Mr. President," he murmured, "this is madness. If they discover who you are—" Traoré raised a hand. "If they discover, then the truth is already out. But if I stay in this palace, I will never know how deep this sickness runs." Diallo hesitated, then produced a small leather pouch. Inside were crisp US dollar bills, each carefully marked with invisible ink that only special scanners could detect. "Your bribe," Diallo said grimly. $1,000, prepared exactly as you asked. Traoré held the money for a long moment. He felt the weight of it, not just the paper, but the injustice it represented. How many times had this exact sum broken a man's spirit, stolen his children's education, or forced a widow to sell her last goat? He tucked the bills into his pocket and whispered, "Tonight, I pay as they pay." Chapter 3. The Road to the Border. The truck roared to life just before dawn. It was an old Mercedes, its paint faded, its engine coughing like an old man. To the ordinary eye, it carried sacks of onions bound for the market across the border. In truth, it carried the president of the nation himself, hidden in plain sight. The road stretched long and dusty, lined with villages where children waved and women carried water jars on their heads. Traoré gripped the wheel tightly, every bump in the road reminding him of the burden he carried. At a roadside cafe, he stopped to drink bitter tea. Around him sat other drivers, their faces worn, their eyes heavy with resignation. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations circling the same theme. "How much will they take this time?" "Always 1,000, brother. Always. If you argue, they beat you. If you refuse, they seize your truck. You lose everything." Traoré listened silently, burning each word into his memory. These were the voices no official report could capture, the voices of men who had suffered in silence for nearly a decade. When one of them turned to him and asked, "Where are you headed, driver?" he forced a weary smile. "South border," he replied in a low, rough tone. "Let's see if luck is kinder to me today." The men chuckled bitterly. Luck? At the border, there is no luck. Only thieves in uniform. Chapter 4. The First Gate. By mid-afternoon, the truck rolled up to the first border post. A rusty barrier blocked the road. A group of uniformed men lounged in the shade. rifles slung casually over their shoulders. One of them, a tall officer with dark sunglasses, stepped forward. He slapped the side of the truck, leaned in through the window, and without even glancing at the cargo, muttered, 1,000. No explanation, no paperwork, no hesitation. Just 2 words, spoken like the law of the land. Traoré felt his jaw tighten. This was it, the moment he had imagined 100 times. Slowly, he pulled the pouch from his pocket and handed over the bills. The officer counted them quickly, then shoved them into his vest. He tapped the barrier with his boot, and it rose lazily. Go. No receipt. No inspection. No record. Just theft, as casual as breathing. As the truck rumbled forward, Traoré's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He had just paid the bribe that had enslaved his people for years. But this time, the bills carried a secret. And soon, the entire rotten network would be exposed. The road after the first checkpoint stretched into emptiness. The horizon burned orange as the sun sank behind the savannah, leaving only the truck's dim headlights cutting through the dark. Inside the cabin, Traoré sat in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The envelope in his pocket was lighter now, but the weight on his chest heavier. He replayed the moment again. And again, the officer's cold voice, the casual theft, the indifference. How many times had this exact ritual repeated? How many millions had vanished in such silent exchanges? He pulled the truck over beside a group of resting drivers. They had built a small fire, boiling tea in a blackened pot. As he joined them, one man with hollow eyes and a deep scar across his cheek spoke up. "You're new," the man said. "Haven't seen you on this route." "First time," Traoré lied. The man chuckled bitterly. "Then welcome to hell. Every mile forward, another thief in uniform. Every gate, another hand reaching into your pocket. You'll be broke before you reach the border." Traoré leaned closer. "How long has it been like this?" The man's eyes darkened. "Since my son was born. He is 8 now." 8 years. Exactly as the reports had said. Another driver spat into the dirt. "We complained once. Organized a strike. But soldiers came. Beat us, jailed us. Since then, silence. We just pay. What else can we do?" The fire crackled. The men sipped their tea in bitter resignation. Traoré studied their faces, men who worked 16-hour days, hauling goods across dangerous roads, yet return home with nothing because of a bribe they could never escape. In that moment, the president inside him wanted to stand and declare his identity, to promise them justice. But the driver inside him knew better. Not yet. The truth needed proof, undeniable and unshakable. So he sat quietly, drinking their bitter tea, while the fire burned low. Chapter 6. The Network. 2 days later, after passing 3 more checkpoints and paying 3 more bribes, Traoré began to see the pattern. Each officer wore a different uniform, customs, police, border guard, but their methods were the same. A nod, a whispered 1,000. A barrier lifted. No paperwork, no questions, just theft. But something else troubled him, the efficiency. At each gate, the demand was identical. The tone, the amount, even the casual confidence. It was not random corruption. It was a system, a machine. Someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings. One afternoon, while pretending to rest at a roadside station, he overheard 2 officers talking near the fuel pumps. "Boss says we send everything to Wagga on Thursday." Same account. Always the same account. Traoré's heart raced. An account. That meant banking, transfers, a money trail. This was not just local soldiers pocketing bills. It was an organized network, reaching far higher than anyone suspected. He memorized their faces, their words, their uniforms. Soon, all of it would be evidence. Chapter 7. A driver's story. At another stop, Traoré shared the road with a young driver named Mamadou. His truck was old, its tires bald, its cargo barely secured. Yet his spirit seemed unbroken. Over a simple meal of rice and sauce, Mamadou spoke openly. "My father was a driver," he said. "He died at this border. Refused to pay. They beat him until he could not stand. They left him in the dust." Traoré froze. The firelight flickered in Mamadou's eyes, reflecting both pain and defiance. Since then, Mamadou continued, I pay. Not for me, but for my family. If I die, they starve. But one day, someone will stop them. Traoré swallowed hard. He wanted to tell Mamadou that the man who would stop them sat right across from him. But the time was not right. Not yet. Instead, he reached across the table, squeezed Mamadou's shoulder, and said softly, That day will come, brother. That day will come. Chapter 8. The Trap Tightens. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Captain Diallo and his covert team tracked the marked bills. Each dollar carried a secret code visible only under ultraviolet light. When the officers deposited their bribes into local banks, the money was flagged instantly. Within days, a picture emerged, multiple deposits, all funneled into the same offshore account controlled by a shell company in Abidjan. The evidence was explosive, but Diallo knew they needed more. They needed the president's word, his direct testimony. And so, he waited, his nerves fraying, as his commander risked everything alone on the border roads. Chapter 9. Confrontation. On the fifth night, as Traoré approached the final border crossing, something shifted. The checkpoint was larger than the others. Floodlights, guard towers, heavily armed soldiers. This was no ordinary bribe station. This was the heart of the network. As his truck rolled forward, a senior officer approached. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished, his gold insignia gleaming. He leaned into the window, studying Traoré with cold eyes. 1,000, he said, voice like iron. Traoré handed over the bills with steady hands. The officer counted them slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the ritual. Then he smirked. You drivers never learn. 8 years, and still you pay like sheep. Traoré's heart pounded. For the first time, rage threatened to break his disguise. He wanted to shout, to reveal himself, to end it all right there. But he forced himself to remain silent. The officer pocketed the bills, waved his hand, and the barrier lifted. As the truck rolled into the darkness beyond, Traoré whispered to himself, Soon, your time is ending. Chapter 10. The President Returns. When Traoré finally returned to Ouagadougou, dust-covered and exhausted, Captain Diallo was waiting. You saw it yourself. Diallo asked. I lived it, Traoré replied, his voice heavy. I paid what every man has paid. I felt their humiliation, their anger, their silence. Now we bring it to light. Diallo handed him a dossier. Inside were bank records, photographs, testimonies, proof of the $347 million stolen over 8 years, proof of the network that had drained the nation. Traoré closed the folder. His eyes burned with determination. Tomorrow, he said, we strike. The palace basement was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. It was here, far from curious eyes, that Traoré and Captain Diallo gathered their most trusted officers. Maps of border routes covered the walls. Photographs of checkpoints and corrupt officials were pinned with red strings. This is not just corruption, Traoré began, his voice steady but cold. This is organized theft on a national scale. They have stolen $347 million from our people. That ends now. A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers clenched their fists, others bowed their heads. Diallo pointed to the map. We have traced the money to accounts in Abidjan. But to bring down the network, we must catch them red-handed. The marked bills from the president are already in circulation. Tomorrow night, we move. One soldier, young and nervous, raised his hand. Sir, what if they resist? These men are heavily armed. Traoré's eyes hardened. Then they will learn the difference between thieves and soldiers of the Republic. Chapter 12. Setting the Trap. The plan was simple, but dangerous. A convoy of trucks, driven by undercover officers, would approach the key border posts. Each would carry marked bills, just like the ones Traoré had handed over. Once the bribes were taken, surveillance teams would move in, recording the exchanges on hidden cameras. At the same time, financial agents in Ouagadougou would monitor the accounts, waiting for the dirty money to move. Once everything was confirmed, simultaneous raids would hit the checkpoints, the money couriers, and the masterminds behind the scheme. It was not just an operation. It was war. Chapter 13. The Long Night. That night, the president could not sleep. He walked the palace halls alone, haunted by the faces of the drivers he had met, the scarred man, Mamadou with his father's memory, the men by the fire sipping bitter tea. Tomorrow, he would carry their voices into battle. Standing at the window, he whispered to himself, "Let tomorrow be the day silence ends." Chapter 14. The raid begins. At 4 a.m., the first truck rolled up to a checkpoint. Hidden cameras recorded every second as an officer stepped forward, demanded his tax, and stuffed the bills into his vest. Within minutes, evidence was secure. Diallo, watching from a command van, gave the signal. Move. Black-clad special forces stormed the checkpoint. Soldiers dropped their teacups in shock as rifles were raised. The corrupt officer who had just taken the bribe froze, the marked bills still in his pocket. "On the ground!" shouted a commando. Chaos erupted across the border zone. Dozens of checkpoints, once symbols of oppression, were seized one by one. Trucks that had once been trapped in endless lines rolled forward freely for the first time in years. Chapter 15. The Mastermind. But the real prize was not the small officers. It was the man who commanded them all. Traoré himself led the raid on a luxurious villa hidden near the border. Inside, they found safes stuffed with cash, ledgers recording payments, and satellite phones connecting the network. And there, in the dining hall, sat Colonel Bako, the mastermind. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished, his smirk unbroken even as soldiers surrounded him. "You think you can destroy this machine?" Bako sneered. "You think you can stop money from flowing? You are a child playing at war." Traoré stepped forward, his voice calm but sharp. "I am not a child. I am the man who drove your roads, paid your bribes, and saw the hunger in my people's eyes. And tonight, your empire ends." Bako's smirk faltered for the first time. Chapter 16. The Evidence. Within hours, warehouses full of seized documents, laptops, and cash were secured. Bank transfers confirmed the offshore accounts. The marked bills tied everything together. Forensic teams worked day and night, piecing together the trail. By dawn, the case was airtight. 8 years, $347 million, hundreds of officers, all connected to one corrupt chain. International observers, once skeptical, were stunned. Never before had such a network been exposed so completely. Chapter 17. The People's Voice. Word spread quickly. In villages and cities, truck drivers wept openly when they heard the news. Markets buzzed with relief. Families embraced fathers, who no longer had to choose between paying a bribe and feeding their children. One driver shouted in the crowded marketplace, "Traoré did not just speak for us, he became one of us. He paid what we paid. He carried our burden. And now he has destroyed it." Crowds cheered his words. Across the nation, horns blared, drums beat, and songs were sung. For the first time in 8 years, the roads of Burkina Faso felt free. Chapter 18. The Revelation. Finally, Traoré appeared on national television. The young president wore no military uniform, only a simple shirt. His eyes carried both fatigue and fire. "My people," he began, "I have walked your roads. I have slept in your trucks. I have paid the bribes you were forced to pay. I have felt your anger, your humiliation, your silence." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "For 8 years, they stole from you $347 million. But tonight, justice has come. The network is broken. The thieves are in chains. And the roads belong to the people once more." The nation erupted. Cheers echoed from the streets of Ouagadougou to the smallest villages in the savannah. Chapter 19. A Promise. Later that night, alone once more, Traoré sat at his desk. The battle was won, but the war against corruption had only begun. He opened a blank notebook and wrote his promise. "Never again shall silence protect the thief. Never again shall fear enslave the driver. I have seen with my own eyes, and I will never forget." He closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and whispered to the darkness, "This is only the beginning." The fall of Colonel Bako's empire did not stay within Burkina Faso's borders. Within days, newspapers across Africa and beyond carried the headline, President goes undercover. Exposes $347 million corruption network. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast, talk radio buzzed with callers demanding their leaders show the same courage. In Brussels and Washington, analysts marveled at the audacity of a sitting president disguising himself as a truck driver. At the IMF headquarters in Geneva, nervous officials whispered about the revelation. For years, they had demanded austerity measures from Burkina Faso, insisting the country was too poor to fund development projects. Now it was clear, the money had always existed, but it had been stolen in silence. One diplomat muttered under his breath, "He has embarrassed the entire international community." Chapter 21. The Courtroom. Weeks later, the trials began. In a grand courtroom packed with journalists, drivers, and grieving families, dozens of officers in crisp prison uniforms sat behind iron bars. At the center was Colonel Bako, his arrogance intact but his empire gone. Prosecutors presented ledgers, bank statements, photographs, and above all, the marked bills. Every bribe taken by the network was traced back to him. Witness after witness testified. Beaten drivers, widows of men who had died refusing to pay, children who had gone hungry because of stolen money. When it was Mamadou's turn, his voice trembled but never broke. "My father died because he refused to pay this man. For 8 years, I carried the burden. But today, I stand free. And I say to him, your reign of fear is finished." The courtroom erupted in applause. Even the judge's gavel could not silence the crowd. Chapter 22. Sentencing. The verdict came after a month of testimony. Colonel Bako was sentenced to life imprisonment. Dozens of his officers received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years. Assets worth hundreds of millions were seized, with plans to return the money to public funds for schools, hospitals, and roads. When the sentence was read aloud, drivers across the nation honked their horns in celebration. In villages, women danced and sang. Children chanted, "No more bribes. No more fear." Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Chapter 23. A Road Reborn. The transformation of the roads was immediate. Where once drivers approached checkpoints with dread, they now passed freely. Soldiers saluted instead of demanding money. The lines of trucks that had stretched for miles vanished overnight. Goods flowed faster, markets grew busier, and prices dropped. Mamadou, now a respected leader among the drivers, stood at the border where his father had once died. He watched trucks roll by without a single coin exchanged. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, he kept his promise. Chapter 24. The International Stage. Invitations poured in for Traoré to speak at international forums. In Addis Ababa, he addressed the African Union. "We cannot beg the world for aid while thieves rob our people at the gates. If we wish for sovereignty, we must first cleanse our own house." In New York, at the United Nations, he declared, "I did not expose corruption with a speech. I exposed it with a steering wheel in my hands, dust in my lungs, and 1,000 stolen dollars in my pocket. Let no leader say they do not know what their people suffer. If they do not know, it is because they choose not to see." The world listened. Some leaders applauded. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Chapter 25. Reform. Back home, Traoré launched sweeping reforms. Independent anti-corruption courts were established. Whistleblower protections became law. Border systems were digitized, reducing human contact and eliminating the hidden tax. A national fund was created, fueled by the recovered millions, to support truck drivers and their families. For the first time, men who had once been broken by silence stood tall, knowing the system was no longer their enemy. Chapter 26. The Ghost of Silence. Yet, even as victories piled up, Traoré was haunted. At night, he dreamed of the first officer he had handed money to, the sunglasses, the cold voice, the barrier rising. He dreamed of Mamadou's father, beaten in the dust. He dreamed of the years lost, the lives crushed, the hunger endured. One evening, alone in his study, he whispered, "Why did it take me this long to see?" The question had no answer, but the guilt drove him forward, pushing him to fight harder, to reform deeper, to ensure the silence never returned. Chapter 27. a nation's pride. Months later, Burkina Faso celebrated Independence Day with new vigor. The parade was not just soldiers and flags, but convoys of trucks, drivers honored as heroes of resistance. Mamadou rode at the front, waving to cheering crowds. Beside him sat the president, not in uniform, but in the same faded cap and dusty jeans he had worn undercover. The symbolism was clear. He was not above them, he was one of them. Chapter 28. The Legacy. Years later, historians would look back on the night. The president went undercover as a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for West Africa as a whole. It proved that corruption, no matter how entrenched, could be uprooted. It proved that leadership was not about speeches, but about sacrifice. And it proved that sometimes the only way to understand the suffering of the people was to walk in their shoes, drive their roads, and pay their price. Chapter 29. The Promise Fulfilled. On the anniversary of the operation, Traoré visited the border where it all began. The checkpoint was gone, replaced by a modern customs station run transparently with digital systems. He stood quietly, watching trucks pass freely. Beside him, Mamadou smiled. "You see, President, the silence is broken. Forever." Traoré nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "I see, brother. I see." Chapter 30. The End of Silence. As the sun set over the savannah, casting gold across the horizon, Traoré wrote once more in his notebook, "A nation does not fall to poverty because of fate, but because of silence. And when silence ends, freedom begins." He closed the book, knowing the battle would never truly be over, but also knowing that he had kept his promise to his people. The roads of Burkina Faso were free. And so, the story of the president who became a truck driver passed into legend.